government is talking about implementing devolution of power. And it has been arguing that devolution of power will empower citizens, give the rights to citizens to decide. And my question was, how do we locate our role in the government mantra of devolution as one thing? The second question that came in my mind was, how do we ensure that as citizens we benefit or we enjoy the Bill of Rights as expanded now? There's one thing having the bill in the Constitution, it's one thing as citizens enjoying those rights. How do we insulate ourselves as citizens to enjoy those rights as pronounced by the Constitution of Zimbabwe, besides having the document? So I want Sakhile to speak to some of those questions. Then when I was looking at the question on people-centered economy that Janet is supposed to talk about, two things came to my mind. One was the government is talking about taking Zimbabwe to be an upper middle income by 2030. And I was saying to myself, what is the role of the citizens in this agenda? What does it mean to us as Zimbabweans? I've been trying to read around, and what I found out is that countries that are upper middle income have the poorest people. And are we not moving towards those countries? Isn't a different way of doing it as Zimbabweans not to use the upper middle income model? Because look at South Africa. Look at the poverty gaps, the rich between the poor. And we're moving towards that as Zimbabweans. Are we not going in that direction? And then when I was looking at the question on business, then I was saying the country, we spoke about this last time. Someone said, are we not prostituting ourselves as a country that anyone can come and loot and take everything that they want? What does it mean to say Zimbabwe is open for business? And where is our role as citizens as we have these investors coming to invest in Zimbabwe? Dr. Webster, for national healing and cohesion, is the country ready for national healing? Do you see indicators from the politicians showing that the country is ready for reconciliation? Do you think we as citizens were ready for national healing and cohesion? Are we seeing the signs? Are the bodies that are put to lead this process having the teeth, the capacity to do this work? What are the signs on the ground? And I was thinking about what's happening in Bulawayo recently. I think it's about 2 or so days ago. There's a gentleman, is a journalist called Denzel Ndebele. Some of you may be knowing the guy, the director for some online platform. This guy has been working on a documentary on the go ground issue. And 2 or so days ago, he was called by the law and order in CID to come and explain why he's doing that. And to me, for us to have cohesion and healing, we need to tell the story. What happened? If it's 2008, what really happened? Let's talk about the story. Then if someone tries to talk about the story and then you're called to explain why you're talking about it, so is the country ready for national healing and cohesion? So without then becoming the presenter now, I will give Sakhile to talk to us on the topic on protecting the rights and promoting the democratic space. It seems she will be using the PowerPoint, so you may then look at that side. She'll be presenting a slide there.
Thank you. I might have technology challenges, but let's ignore those for a little bit. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Hi. My name is Sakhile Sifelani-WIPSU. I am with an organization called Women in Politics Support Unit. And I was a little bit conflicted when I was invited to come. I'm now confessing Briggs does not know. Because I was struggling to formulate how I would present what I wanted to say in a way that would not alienate, but in a way that would seek to give a different perspective and hopefully influence some of the things that we are seeing by bringing in a different way of seeing things. because I think we have come from an election and it has been polarized. But there's also been a lot of things that have also been very invisible. And so in talking about those things, how do we make the invisible visible, but at the same time do it not to pursue, to pursue more social cohesion as opposed to polarize? So I want to just start with my little disclaimer. I don't know what I've done.
Now we must go upside.
At least you put a disclaimer that you're challenged.
I
challenge.
all of this
Yes, I think.
Or they can do it for me.
Yeah, I think I must remove my, take away my powers. Thank you. Okay, let me just go to the next slide. Okay, so I wanted to start by saying whose rights are we wanting to protect? Whose democratic space do we want to protect? And I think I've already talked about the first point, but I wanted to remind us that from the women's perspective, we wanted, yes, the free, fair, credible, but we also wanted an equitable election, where we have been in election mode in this country ever since, depending on how you count your elections. Zimbabwe is a highly electioned country, and if you talk to women, women don't like to hear election. And when you talk to the democracy, in the democratic space, people say, we need to go to an election and we need to have a good quality election so that we can move on. But what does it mean when you persistently have half the population saying, we are not interested in the election? This election brings violence, it brings X, it brings Y, it brings ongoing and continuing conflicts, and they deepen and entrench inequalities in our communities. We don't want them. And what I'm saying is that it is actually challenging, because elections, if you go to elections, we're talking about World War II. Where basically in our UN framework, we then say, this is how we're going to manage political space. We are going to have elections. And I always want to just put it there as a food for thought, to say, increasingly around the world, we are facing the rise of conservatism, the rise of all of these things that are eroding the human rights standards and the principles that we are working for. And why is it that we agreed to a particular methodology? I'm not saying we should challenge it, but why is it that the elections are the only acceptable methodology? And yet increasingly you can see that there is a pushback against that methodology. That is food for thought. Do not respond. Do not. But going forward, we cannot have a viable or a sustainable democracy without equality. And when I talk about equality, I don't mean just the numbers of women, because I know at WIPSU that's what we do. We count women. We can count you left, right, and center. We count women, but we were talking about substantive equality. How do we have a country that begins to have the stability that is brought about by having substantive equality at the center, as opposed to being a police find attached, as Sally says? And so I want to bring, for example, the spaces that matter. And maybe we can go to the next slide. Thank you. From whom are we doing this rights protection? Who is the person who is eroding the rights or taking away the right? Who are we trying to get power from? And the first one I want to put there is that, interestingly enough, with the change in demographics, citizens are beginning to be the ones who are actually eating away at the very rights that they want protected. And if we don't openly say it and we don't talk about it, we're going to have a problem going forward in how to fix it. We talk about the dividend of youth, we talk about the dividend of women, we talk about the election dividend to say, 60% of the people who voted were young, 54% were young, and then 60% of them were women, and those women, you now want to punish us. Those women were in rural areas. Why do you want to punish us? Where have you been the past 5 years in terms of women and in the rural communities? What are we doing in those rural communities? Are we listening to the things that they're saying, or are we trying to teach them what we want them to say? I like to give the example of when the bond note started. I think, Janet, you will remember. When the bond note started, the majority of civil society kept saying, we don't want it, it's a bad idea for our society. And we all knew the economic arguments. But for people who are out there who are disenfranchised, they were like, we have nothing, we can't be doing barter trade. Give me something. Give me eco-cash if it will be eco-cash. Give me that bond note, but I can't be on barter. It doesn't work. So we need to begin to give more priority to that language and engage in that language, as opposed to trying to shift the conversation. Because for them, that is the conversation that matters, and it has ramifications elsewhere. And so now, for example, we'll talk about the 40% being the youth. I laugh because I was saying to a friend of mine yesterday, they had never had their vote stolen, so they didn't know how it felt. That's why they were angry. Some of us, we've had our vote stolen many times. We have accepted this reality. We are comfortable. And I'm not saying that that is right, but what I'm trying to say is we have a huge a population that is experiencing things for the first time and in different ways. We need to be able to change the mechanisms of engagement, to be able to change the architecture in which we engage, to be able to have the meaningful conversations. I won't talk about the state because I think your questions were already about that. But I wanted to talk about where the local and the international are meeting. We have an issue around ideology. There is an ideology in Zimbabwe that is moving, and it is a neoliberal ideology. It's an ideology that feels that it is very comfortable in terms of privatizing certain things, doing certain things in a certain way. But if we continue to operate without naming the thing that we are fighting against, we're going to have a problem, because we will then have inadequate tools and mechanisms to respond to it. And the second one is the rising toxic, I'm not from the church, but I think Dr. Nieza can speak to it, but the rising toxic religion that we have in different spaces of the religious sector. You also have this with a conservatism that is also being matched. I mean, you've just seen the elections in Sweden, for example, and it's building solidarity, not just within a continent, but internationally and globally. And it's beginning to bring problematic narratives into the development space. And then, of course, the one that I'm going to spend a lot of time on is people are tired of a Zimbabwe with problems. There is Zimbabwean fatigue, and we have to accept it. And this Zimbabwe fatigue is making everyone say, as long as the bus is moving, let's just go. Next slide, please. So we are moving on as a country. And in moving on, what are we doing? I'm talking about the risks. I clearly am not going to be talking about the positive things. There are many positive things, but I want to focus on the challenges. We are normalizing the abnormal. And I think here I'm going to lose friends immediately. It is not normal for a government to ask me to send them eco-cash to sort out cholera. And it is not normal for society in all sorts of sectors to actually beat me up for saying, why are you doing that? Because that is what has happened in Zimbabwe. There are too many things that are normalized, that are seriously abnormal. And it is our duty as civil society to point it out, and we have the right to point that out. But we also have an obligation to begin to educate, to say, why is it like that? It is nice that the corporate sector is coming on board, but it is not their job to do that. They have a responsibility to do certain things. But I cannot be eco-cashing central government to sort out cholera. Did you star 151? Did you? $1? Okay. The fractured and polarized, we are currently doing post-2018 reviews, and one of the things that is happening is that these reviews of the 2018 elections are happening in fractured processes, in fractured ways. I'm now going to share that from the women's perspective, one of the issues we always try to raise is all forms of violence. And yet the violence that people focus on in this society is, cross-party violence, 1. 2, we focus on physical violence. And yet we saw unprecedented levels of hate speech. We saw unprecedented levels of internal party violence. And because it was done in that way, you found low incident reporting, regardless of whether you had a situation room, whether you had a rights referral center, whether you had a responsive network at a peace building network. You found very few people activated those systems, simply because the mechanisms were set up for the old problems, not for the new problems. And so what you saw, for example, in our work, we have seen a lot of women who've come forward who experience phenomenal levels of internal party violence and do not have the ability to report. And do not have because we know what happens in our political spaces. So what does that mean when we now have violence that is gone invisible? And we are going to have to operate and work in that space. I just want to put that there. And this ongoing and contestation of spaces, it might be operating in the political space like what Briggs was saying, and we want to move on. But the problem that is there is that they are playing out their contestation in communities. And those communities do not have the support of anybody else except for the interested or parties with conflicts of interest. So the people who are causing problems in one sector are spilling over into the public domain. And the public domain is not being escorted by a sufficiently strengthened civil society to be able to enable them to respond. So even when you look at the issues around the mining, whatever, how many communities actually have their own capacity to deal with degradation, the environmental degradation that comes in? So as a result, you will find that the person who's the interested party is the same person who is supposed to come and bring a solution. I think those ones are self-explanatory, but I'm going to go on to the millennial capitalism, which is something I learned. I saw Comrade Briggs' Joy is here. We learned recently that we have something called millennial capitalism that is pervading our society, where it's about individualism, it's about young people, individualism, it's momentary, it's etc., etc. So your ability to build the solidarity we need is fractured by the way that this particular dividend sees our communities. Can I just jump on forward? These are the spaces, these are the challenges, but also opportunities that I see. The first one is that we've gone back to the drawing board. We have to go back to the drawing board because we now have to work on literally attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors. If we don't work on attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors, we're going to be operating as though everybody believes that we have standards, those standards are legitimate, and those standards should be respected. So we cannot even begin to speak about the right of women to be there, or the right for you to actually, I was in a meeting where people talking about the right to water, and they were saying, yeah, but local authorities spend a phenomenal amount of money cleaning the water so that we can use it. Therefore, we cannot let you have water for free. You have to pay for it. But it comes from these beliefs, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that are warped, that are not respecting the very fact that in your own local standard, in your constitution, you say water, you have the right to water. So how do you begin to build and move on? Because I think Zimbabwe is moving on. How are you going to move on meaningfully on issues of water when we're already coming from a fractured base? So there's a lot of learning that needs to be done. I don't want to call it civic education, but we need to go back to literally saying, do we understand what are human rights? Do we understand what those rights mean? Do you understand that we must hold the line? Because right now there is no line to hold. Because many of us are buying into this language. Then we go to the issues around the independence and autonomy of communities. I say that also as a women's rights activist, to say you can't move forward, and research has shown you can't move forward unless you have independent and autonomous movements that take you elsewhere. But in this environment, we also need to strengthen independent and autonomous communities. And as to your question around devolution and decentralization, how do we begin to make communities understand what decentralization means and what devolution means, and for them to be able to operate and be independent communities, rather than communities that are constantly vulnerable? 4 million people are currently on humanitarian aid. They cannot feed themselves. So if you cannot feed yourself, how are you going to do anything else? This is a fantastic opportunity that people don't want to pay attention to, the public service reform. You know, the president keeps talking about it. It's been on the cards since the early 90s, but it's actually happening. You are seeing, shifts within the public service that we have not seen for or haven't seen for years. We have change of practice in the public sector that we have not seen in many years. But are we paying attention to these shoots? We should be able to go in there and bust it right open. One of the things where administrative systems are where your rights are lost. And in Zimbabwe, I know that Thabo Mbeki is not popular, but he was my favorite president. Thabo Mbeki said, in Zimbabwe, we take a political problem and we give it an administrative solution. We take an administrative problem and we give it a political solution. And now we have an opportunity. We have someone who has actually opened the door to the administrative nature of the public service, which is the machinery that begins to deliver or to erode your rights. If you are a woman, what does it mean to have an agricultural lease where your name is at the back of the deed? What is that? Why is it at the back? Is that a witness? Are you witnessing somebody's ownership? What are you doing when you're signing at the back of the slip? So I'm saying we have an entry to begin to defend rights administratively, to create systems that actually respond and protect rights. And my argument about the alignment of laws that characterized the past 5 years was that it wasn't about the rights. It was about the system that was supposed to deliver on those rights. And that's what we didn't have reform on. So this is a fantastic opportunity. The next one is about new mechanisms. We have new threats in areas that civil society has to be built for purpose. And the current civil society is built for the purpose that it was dealing with. But we have new areas of interventions. How can we begin to support civil society to have the architecture and to have the mechanisms to deal with the new threats? So, for example, within the area of decentralization and devolution, it can't be something that belongs to the residents' associations. It has to descend into citizenry. But the holders of that and the guiders of that have to be a broad-based civic forum, because that's where the nitty-gritty rights will lie. And that's where we need to be. And we will not be in those spaces if we don't create new mechanisms. The last one is around the economic rebuilding. I think I've already highlighted this in my contributions about the kind of economy we want. Nobody in Zimbabwe wants an economy where there is a burn rate of 110%. Nobody wants that. We all want to move on. But in the way that we are moving on, are we offering an alternative? Because the current alternative is neoliberal in nature, and it is privatizing state goods and state resources. And then it comes back to you, and it's in your personal pocket to pay for what they should have paid for anyway. So how do we begin to talk about that developmental state that we want in a practical way, and to enable citizens to articulate that, not for us to be the ones who articulate it? Because if you have listened, government keeps saying, I was with the local government, Prime Secretary said, we are moving on whilst you are still here. We are busy moving on. You can talk all you want, but we are moving on and we're going to fix Zimbabwe. So are we jumping onto this train, and what are we going to be saying when we're on the train? That should be my last comment. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sakhile. Sakhile spoke to the whose rights and whose space. She spoke about normalizing the abnormal. She spoke about our polarized society that we are failing to resolve disputes. She spoke about, just towards the end, she says that they are moving on and we are being left behind, right? They are moving on and we are left behind. So who is the government, by the way? Is it us or them? Who is the government? They are moving on, we are being left out. Where are they going? I mean, we need to ask those questions to say, okay, the government says, let's move on. If you are complaining and we move on, and who is moving on? Where are they going? And where are we remaining, or what are we remaining doing?